Learned women, even the happiest, have ignored the true happiness. Émile Fages wrote in 1894 in his review of Repierre's book Les Femmes et la Science, Women and Science. Two French women, mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists, Amélie du Châtelet and Sophie Germain, were included in this publication, and it is their own treatment of happiness that this paper is about, through a diffractive reading of their philosophical writings. By referring to diffractive readings, I follow lines of feminist affirmative approaches to theoretical texts, reading, as Karen Barad has written, and I quote here, important insights through one another, and thus reworking concepts that structure these insights in the traditions of thought from which they stem. Having been neglected for long, Du Châtelet's and Germain's philosophical work has become the object of a burgeoning body of literature, particularly in the Francophone scholarly world. But while some connections have been drawn between the two women in the history of science and mathematics in France, particularly in relation to how they were used and abused in discourses around women's education, their philosophical writings have not been discussed in their interrelation. Moreover, Germain's œuvres philosophiques have not been translated in English, despite their importance in the 19th century European history of ideas, which was highlighted and praised by eminent philosophers like Auguste Comte. Du Châtelet's life has become the object of numerous biographies, studies, and essays, and there is an important body of literature on her significant contribution to the history of philosophy and science. Born to an upper-class family of the old regime, she was brought up to realize her destiny as a dutiful daughter of the aristocracy. And yet her life took an unexpected twist and was eventually devoted to the study of mathematics and science, as well as philosophy. Du Châtelet saw some of her scientific work published during her life and took pride in asserting herself as an important and recognizable intellectual figure of the Enlightenment. Due to her untimely death at childbirth at the age of 42, however, an important body of her philosophical and scientific work was either published posthumously or remained unpublished and scattered in Voltaire's papers, who was her lover, scientific collaborator, discussant, and lifelong friend. Her essay, Discours sur le bonheur, Discourse on Happiness, was probably written over a long period of time between the end of the 1730s, when she was still with Voltaire, but living through the end of their amorous relationship, into the 1740s. It was finally finished in the spring of 1748, during a period that she was in love with Jean-François de Saint-Lambert, to whom it was presented as a gift. Although multiple manuscripts were circulated and read amongst her friends while she was still alive, the book was first published in 1779, 30 years after her death. It is perhaps her most famous text, and it appeared in numerous translations and many editions. However, at the time of its publication, it was ignored, and later it received overall negative critiques from the early 19th century into the 20th. In writing an essay on happiness, Du Châtelet participated in what Robert Mozy, the editor of the Discourse Critical Edition in 1960, has configured as the glorious discovery of the French Enlightenment in his own study on the idea of happiness. Happiness for the Enlightenment intellectuals was, of course, an earthly attainment and indeed an overall purpose in life within the wider context of Western secularization. But in reviewing the French approaches to happiness in the 17th and 18th centuries, Mozy found them insignificant, pedantic, poor in quality, and indeed pitiful, with the exception of Du Châtelet's treatise, which was, in his view, original and the only work worth reading in the 20th century. Du Châtelet followed the order of discourse in the Enlightenment philosophical literature on happiness with two critical interventions. She wrote about happiness as a woman, thus disturbing and indeed gendering the abstractness and universality of the philosophical discourse, and in doing so, she included her lived experiences in the premises of her treatise. While emerging from the author's lived experiences, however, the discourse belongs to the Enlightenment tradition of the pursuit of happiness, but at the same time, it bends this tradition in the author's refusal to talk about universal forms of happiness, and it is here that the value and originality of her treatise lies. In addressing the question of whether it is possible to be happy, a classical theme in the Enlightenment tradition, Du Châtelet acknowledges the difficulty of attaining the state of happiness, but directs her readers to the importance of reason in carefully planning their conduct in the anticipation of happiness. She writes, "We commonly believe that it is difficult to be happy, and we have much reason to believe this. But it would be much easier for men to become happy if they could reflect on and plan their conduct before acting." Du Châtelet's entry in the discourse of happiness thus firmly situates her in the rationalist tradition, or perhaps here hers is a rationalist or modern Epicureanism, as Mozy has commented, while also identifying a paradox in the way she calls for planned actions, while at the same time embracing passions and illusions. To be happy, it is necessary to have freed oneself of prejudices, to be virtuous and in good health, to have tastes and passions, and to be susceptible to illusions, since we owe the majority of our pleasures to illusion, and unhappy is the person who loses that capacity, she writes. Far then from seeking to dispel illusion by the lanterns of reason, let us try to thicken the glaze that it lays on most objects, more necessary for them than are the cares and adornments of our bodies. What Mozy finds paradoxical here in Du Châtelet's modern Epicureanism is precisely the tour de force of her approach to happiness through the realm of sensations and passions. Being interested in literature and the arts through her education, but also through her active participation in the culture of the salons, du Châtelet was also passionate about theatre and the opera, and throughout her life she wrote about the pleasures of immersing in the illusions of the performing arts as a gate to happiness. Why du Châtelet's emphasis both on passions and the illusions deflects from the Enlightenment idea on happiness? The question of how passions are to be understood is also raised in the Discours. Here, du Châtelet configures a clear hierarchy between passions and tastes, les goûts, in terms of their importance for happiness. In reading du Châtelet's Discours, Véronique Leury has traced Cartesian traits in her theorization of passions. Whitehead has also pointed out that in listing what she calls the great machines of happiness, du Châtelet follows the Epicurean tradition that Mauzy has already identified. When it comes to du Châtelet's elaboration of the multifarious connections between passions and happiness, what I suggest, however, is that she also follows Spinoza's traces in the philosophical history of emotions, particularly around the importance of joy as central to the ethics of a good life. For Spinoza, of course, passions are inescapable parts of our lives. They can be beneficial, and they finally become barometers of our power in attaining a life of virtue, depending on whether they increase or decrease our power to act. In the same vein, du Châtelet warns her readers that passions must be made to serve our happiness, while others, like ambition, should be avoided. She finally refers to passions which are vices, like hatred, vengeance, rage, and which absolutely diminish our power to be happy. One must never be vicious if one does not want to be unhappy, she writes. While configuring a relational notion of happiness, our happiness will always depend on others, as she writes, du Châtelet nevertheless observes that the less our happiness depends on others, the easier it is for us to be happy. Here it is important to highlight that although happiness is a relational feeling in the Discours, men and women experience it differently. Among the very few sources of happiness that women have access to, the love for study is the most independent and constant one, and the whole Discours revolves around it. The love for study holds within it a passion from which an elevated soul is never entirely exempt, that of glory, she wrote. Men can find infinite sources for glory and therefore happiness in their life, she goes on to observe. But women are excluded by their state from any kind of glory, and thus for them, the love for study is of all the passions the one that contributes the most to our happiness, as we have already seen. Her own engagement with the study of science and mathematics was a living example of how the work on happiness was materialized in her life. Indeed, du Châtelet's scientific publications, the fruits of her love for study, became her independent sources of happiness. Her famous Foundations of Physics, first published anonymously in 1741, and then again in 1742, with both her name and her portrait on its frontispiece, which almost immediately translated in German and Italian in 1743. Her last years were dedicated to the translation and commentary on Newton's Principia Mathematics, which was published posthumously in 1759 after her untimely death on September 10, 1749. Sophie Germain's life has been told and retold from several angles and in different genres and media over the years. Almost all renditions of her life, however, draw on two historical sources. The first came from her friend Guglielmo Libri, an Italian mathematician and member of the French Academy of Sciences, who wrote her obituary in the Journal des Débats on May 18, 1832, almost 1 year after her passing, and it was then included in the preliminaries of the first publication of her philosophical work, Considérations Générales, in 1833. The second was written by Jean-Léon Hippolyte Stupy, a poet, playwright, and literary figure. His study first appeared in the 1879 publication of her Œuvre philosophique and was included again in its second edition in 1896. What I have found interesting in studying these first two biographical sources is the unacknowledged iterations that slip from the first to the second, eventually creating a biographical matrix within which all subsequent biographies are entangled. Germain's unfinished treatise, Considérations Générales, comprises two chapters. In the first, she formulates the simple thesis that the human mind is subject to laws, and the character of truth is a spontaneous feeling of order and proportion. Both the sciences and the letters are therefore dominated by this feeling, which is common to them, and in this vein, order, proportion, and simplicity are intellectual necessities, eventually leading to the universal type of the beautiful and the true. In this context, Germain looks at the intellectual processes in which both the mathematician and the poet are immersed in search of beauty and truth. Happiness springs at the moment when the idea which will drive the creation of a work of art or a mathematical treatise first emerges, but it also follows the whole process of scientific, literary, and artistic creation. For his part, the mathematician, le géomètre, pays close attention to the happy idea that directs his research. All the forces of his intelligence will be employed in unfolding the chain of truths contained in this first truth. Germain often returns to the notion of the happy idea, a linguistic recurrence which is not accidental, since in tracing the process of creation, Germain also points to the importance of the choice of style and makes reflections of remarkable accuracy on the perfection of language in literature and of the language of calculations in mathematics. In the realm of the aesthetics of style and language, then, the happy idea is a carefully chosen notion that takes us back to the link between knowledge and happiness in the Enlightenment tradition that Germain also follows in the creation of her Considérations. In the second chapter of her treatise, Germain follows a historical investigation of her principles through different periods in science and culture. She traces the process of universalization in the works of the antiquity and the Middle Ages, from the first astronomical knowledge up to the foundation of Cartesian geometry and Newton's discoveries, and highlights the importance of mathematics in conveying pure truth. In doing so, she juxtaposes the obscurity of the philosophical language with the language of the exact sciences, which has always been precise and clear. We had to get lost, and yet the errors of the human mind, which would seem inexhaustible, are all closer to certain truths and have not been so numerous as the defect of the processes could make it presume. This is because the feeling of truth, le sentiment du vrai, has never abandoned the authors of all these systems. This happy feeling, cet heureux sentiment, was not enough to preserve them from arbitrary and false suppositions, but it captured their imagination within certain limits. Germain's reference to the happy feeling is remarkable in this extract, very much related to the joys, pleasures, and happiness of knowledge that we have seen in the Châtelet's take. Happy or not, the notion of feeling, sentiment, is indeed recurrent in the discourse of the consideration, but what is important to highlight here is that the main thrust of Germain's take on feelings is very different from the common understanding of feeling as affects or emotions. Throughout her treatise, she refers to sentiment as the precursor of human understanding, the first stone in the long process of reasoning and knowledge production, as well as the path to the ethics and aesthetics of human existence. Whether she refers to a profound feeling of order and proportions, which is the regulator of all intellectual movement, either in the works of high literature or the rich discoveries in science, a feeling of continuity, a feeling of analogy, or a feeling of freedom, Germain configures a universal feeling, which corresponds to a universal type of truth and has given rise to the creation of the human mind. We can no longer doubt it. The sciences, the letters, and the fine arts were born out of one and the same feeling. They have reproduced, according to the means which constitute the essence of each of them, endlessly renewed copies of this innate model, a universal type of truth, so strongly imprinted in higher minds. As a matter of fact, whenever we get pleasure from a trait of genius or a trait of eloquence in science, in fine arts, or in literature, it is because through them we can discern previously unseen relations, and we are transported in a realm where we discover an unexpected order of ideas or feelings, she wrote. Feelings also emerged in her Pensées, which were also published in the volume of her Œuvre philosophique as a mathematical set of thought fragments connected to movement and power. Force is in the body the faculty of moving itself and of moving others. It is in us the feeling of power. Feelings are, in short, connected to the focus of Germain's philosophical work, namely investigating the how of intellectual processes. In her Pensées, Germain often makes transpositions between science and politics through the lens of happiness. Happy is the nation which joins constancy to wisdom. It lives peacefully and quietly without being bored with its happiness, she wrote, juxtaposing it with those restless nations that are constantly tormented by their activity and oscillate around happiness without ever attaining it. And yet, even within the chaos of trouble, thought moves and something new emerges. This anxiety, she writes, produces the movement of thoughts. It is within trouble, quarrels, and divisions. It is in the theater of ambition that the genius appears on earth. She wrote this having perhaps in mind the turbulent times within which she lived, thought and created just after the French Revolution. Perhaps she had felt the importance of the pursuit of happiness, which would become later on, as we know, central in Arendt's political thought, and today is a theme around which philosophers who follow Arendtian traits like Adriana Cavarero and Olivia Guaraldo in Verona are also following. In reading diffractively Du Châtelet and Germain's philosophical work, with a particular focus on their treatment of happiness, what I have argued in this paper is that their take on happiness has nothing to do with the gendered norms and discourses of happiness that they were seen and judged by in the longue durée of the 19th and 20th centuries. Their happiness was more in line with the joys and pleasures of knowledge, understanding, and creating. We act only insofar as we understand, Spinoza has famously written. Greater understanding gives subjects an increased sense of feeling their power, and this empowering process also enacts a new source of joy and puts in motion, I would add, the machines of happiness. In this context, knowledge and adequate understanding are the key to human happiness, freedom, and well-being in Spinoza's philosophy, as Steve Nadler has pointed out. Whether taken as sensations that will lead to happy ideas, or illusions and passions that can serve our happiness, feelings are central in the philosophical work of both Du Châtelet and Germain, and yet one can scarcely find any of these two women philosophers and scientists mentioned, discussed, or cited in the current burgeoning literature revolving around feelings and happiness, or in the philosophical discussions of happiness. What I suggest is that it is high time that their work entered the archives of knowledge, which will be significantly enriched and widened by their ideas and writings. Thank you.